The Gospel according to Mark, the 9th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. He was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them, Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. So coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. We've been following Jesus right from when he was born. And if you paid attention to what we have seen in the process of following Jesus, you're going to see some transition points in the life of Jesus up until this time. The first transition point was, remember, after 8 days after he was born, he was circumcised and was presented in the temple where Zechariah had been waiting for a long time to see the salvation of the Lord. That transition point in the life of Jesus ushered him into just an ordinary life as any Hebrew boy who had just been born. That was the beginning of a very normal life as a Jewish boy. Fast forward 12 years, we're brought to another point of transition in the life of Jesus, and this is after the Passover in Jerusalem. His family is returning back home to Nazareth. Assuming that Jesus is in the crowd as people are traveling back, parents didn't worry too much about their children in that time. It was a very community-oriented lifestyle where kids would mingle. And the parents, assuming that their son Jesus was with the kids for 3 days, they walked back to Nazareth only to find that he was nowhere to be found. And so they had to trace back into the temple in Jerusalem, and there they found him sitting in the middle of the theologians, the elders, exchanging theological points. And everybody was amazed at the level of wisdom and at the level of understanding that this 12-year-old boy had. It was a transition that began to clue people into the fact that this was just no ordinary child, that there is something about this 12-year-old. And then we make our way to the third transition point in the life of Jesus, and that is when he presents himself to be baptized by John. And at this point, we think that he's around 30 years of age. And that transition point is one that ushers him into the commencement of the ministry on earth, which he'd come to fulfill. And there was a sub-transition there where he goes off into the desert to be tempted by the devil. And upon return from 40 days of fasting, he commences his ministry, which we've looked at in the past couple of Sundays. Which brings us to this transition point that we've just read from here, when he goes off to the mountain where he is transfigured in the presence of 3 of the inner circle of his disciples. So let's look at this transition point, because what it does, brothers and sisters, is it prepares us for what is to come. It sets in motion, as I said at the beginning, things that are going to lead to the fulfillment of the ultimate reason as to why Jesus came to earth, and that is heading to the cross. But we need to understand what had happened before Jesus went up to the mountain of Transfiguration with his disciples, because when we read the Gospel according to Mark, here is how it starts there in verse 2. It says 6 days later. 6 days later assumes that something has happened 6 days prior. We are on the 6th day since something has been happening. So we need to find out what that is, because that establishes the base upon which the story of the Transfiguration is built. So where do we go to establish the events that had happened in the 6 days before today leading up to this? If we are being told in Mark chapter 9, at the beginning of Mark chapter 9, that there had been 6 days of activity, then we just have to go back to Mark chapter 8. So let's turn to Mark chapter 8, and there we shall establish the things that had happened in the 6 days leading up to today, and see what those things tell us by way of setting the stage for what happens today. We go back to Mark chapter 8. Jesus begins to talk about his death and resurrection. Mark chapter 8, reading at verse 31, says, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." So Jesus is in the town of Caesarea Philippi up north. Now, there are two Caesareas in Scripture. There is one that's on the west coast on the Mediterranean. That is just Caesarea. But then there is a Caesarea Philippi up north, and that's where this is happening. Now, the reason why I belabor the point of location is that if they are up north in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus says that he's about to undergo great suffering, where is that going to be? In Jerusalem. Jerusalem is south. So they're beginning the journey from Caesarea Philippi that will lead Jesus into Jerusalem, where he would be crucified. And that is important. Like I said, it sets the stage for what happens in Holy Week. And so what else did Jesus say? So he tells them that he is about to undergo great suffering, would be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then verse 32 says, he said all of this quite openly. No uncertain terms. There was nothing vague, which is the reason why Peter takes issue with this. He fully understands what Jesus is talking about, and is about to have none of that. What does Peter do? Peter takes Jesus aside, and the Bible tells us that he begins to rebuke Jesus. Now, I want you to think for a minute what's happening here. Before this, Jesus had asked the disciples a very interesting and important question. If we read back in verse 27, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And here is what they said. Some say you are John the Baptist. There was some conspiracy theories as to the identity of Jesus. So Jesus is trying to settle that with the disciples. So they say, some say you are John the Baptist, and the others say you are Elijah. Still others say you are one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, but you, the disciples, who do you say that I am? And listen to who responds. It is Peter who answers, and he says, you, Jesus, are the Messiah, Mashiach, the anointed, the Son of the living God. And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. So with that in mind, and then Jesus says he's about to be betrayed. How come Peter, who is supposed to know Jesus as Mashiach, Messiah, the Son of the living God, pulls him aside, the person he declared to be the Son of God, he now begins to rebuke. And I want you to picture this. Whenever my parents rebuked me, my dad, we lost my dad, but my mom is still there. She doesn't do this anymore. But whenever they would rebuke me, They just never spoke words. They used gestures. Some of you may relate to this. You may resonate. It may resonate with you. There was the pointing of a finger with a rebuke. There was the sharp eye. There was a sharp look at you that communicated the disapproval of what you had done. There was the stern pointing at you. When Peter pulls Jesus to the side and rebukes him, I can imagine that he does that with a gesture, which surprises me because he's supposed to know Jesus as Messiah, but he does not like where Jesus is going because it does not benefit him the way that he understood Jesus to have come and fulfill what he was supposed to have come to fulfill on earth. But then Jesus turns the tables around and also rebukes Peter. What Jesus says to Peter is, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." So let me say this, brothers and sisters, as I set the stage. Before our reading today, the stage is set where Jesus begins to introduce what's about to happen to him, and he wants to bring the heavenly mission down, but Peter and the rest of the disciples do not understand it as such. So in the mountain of transfiguration, at the mountain of transfiguration, that is all about to be clarified, that is all about to be made clear, so that when the trip continues to Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John would have had a better understanding as to what this is all about, which means when you and I, brothers and sisters, accompany Peter, James, and John up the mountain of transfiguration, and let's just be flies on the wall, maybe flies on the cloud, we, like them, will come down from there with a different understanding as to why Jesus came to earth to begin with. So let's get back to our reading as we have it today. So 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And look at what happens next. Jesus was transfigured before them. And here is how that all played out. They look at Jesus. His clothes were just like their clothes. Going up to the mountain, they all had dusty clothes. There is no way you can have a pure white fabric in that region of the world and expect it to continue to be such. So as they're going up the mountain, they have on gowns and robes. But then when they look at Jesus, all of a sudden, here is what happens to his robe. The Bible says his clothes became dazzling white. There is no way in that region of the world anybody can have a robe that looks the way that it is being described, other than the fact that something has happened. The word for it is transfigured. Jesus looks very different than the way he looked going up. God is getting their attention. While they'd had some glimpse of Jesus to be an extraordinary person, they are now about to know him as he truly is, so they can understand and appreciate what he is about to do in the days to come. His clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. Here is what happens, brothers and sisters, when your clothes are soiled, especially if they are white. You get the bleach to take off the stain. And so then you get your clothes off of the washer, you look at them, you have a smile on your face. Let me distinguish between your purest white clothes and what we have going on here. Yes, you may have the purest white-looking clothes in the world, but think about this for a minute. The moment you pull those clothes out of the washer, if there's some dust particles in your house, even though they may not be visible to the naked eye, the moment those dust particles settle on your fabric that is pure white, it is no longer as pure as when you got it out of your washer. And at that point, it becomes different than what we have with the fabric that Jesus is wearing. Dazzling white. There may be dust particles up the mountain, but at this point, none of those particles can settle on Jesus because he's just been transfigured, and the disciples are able to see that. There's a song that we sing during the Transfiguration Sunday that says, "How good, Lord, to be here." And then one of the stanzas of that song says, Jesus shines with unborrowed light. What the disciples are seeing, what makes the clothes of Jesus to look the way they are, is that there is light that's emanating out of Jesus. It is unborrowed light. It is self-contained light. The dazzle that they see on the fabric is coming from inner light, the light of Jesus. Let me illustrate it this way. We have this cross here, and if you look very carefully at it, you're going to see that it is shining. This cross, this brass, contains no light whatsoever. The reason it shines is because up there is the light that hits the brass, that hits the cross, and then you see it shining. It shines from borrowed light. A few years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., visiting our daughter who was attending George Washington University at the time. And I had parked there on I Street just off of 22nd, and that was in the afternoon. And I was sitting in the car waiting for her to come out, and all of a sudden I felt this heat coming off to the side, hitting the window of my car. And I knew that I was in the middle of the street with tall buildings, so there was no reason why I should be feeling any effect of the sun. I looked up, the sun had hit the window of one of the buildings and then reflected it downwards. I felt the heat from the sun, but that was because it had bounced off of the window. It was borrowed heat. And so Jesus is shining before the disciples, not because there is some sun out there that hits his clothes and then produces that dazzling white effect. There is light that's coming out of Jesus himself that causes all of that. Why am I making this point? Peter had misunderstood who Jesus was. Peter had put Jesus aside and rebuked him, not realizing that this man is a different man. Now look at what happens next, and then it's going to put everything into greater perspective. While they're there, while Jesus shows up like this, accompanying him out of nowhere are two recognizable Old Testament characters. One is Moses, representing the law of God. The other is Elijah, representing the prophets. Both had said something about the coming of Jesus in the New Testament, so they're here to confirm what they had prophesied in the Old Testament. It is as if they're telling Jesus, we know your mission coming up in the next few days. We're here to tell you that we've known about it in the Old Testament, and we want to encourage you to go all the way with it. They're telling Jesus, we spoke about what you're here for, and please, go all the way. Now, while they're looking at this, Peter, vintage Peter, typical Peter, he says, look, this is too great. Lord, I have an idea. Why don't we build three dwellings rather, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Let's just hang out here forever. Do you remember Peter 2 Sundays ago? They're in Capernaum. Jesus heals masses of people. He casts out evil spirits out of a man, and greater throngs of people come. Do you remember Peter's idea? He goes looking for Jesus and rebukes him again. Where are you? Everybody's looking for you. Peter wants things established where they are at that moment. And Jesus says, let us go to the other town so I may heal them there also. For that is why I came. Jesus never wants to be confined. Jesus wants to go where the mission is. Peter wants Jesus up the mountain. Jesus has his eyes set on the cross. Peter needs to understand why Jesus came, which is why God now gets involved. While they're talking, a cloud comes and descends upon them. The cloud can represent God. We know this from the Exodus. As they marched to the promised land, there was a cloud by day that accompanied them, representing the presence of God. There was the fire by night accompanying them, representing the presence of God. So when the cloud descends upon them, it is God himself and forms this envelope. They're enveloped by this cloud. God has their attention. And then the word comes from heaven into the cloud and says, Peter, James, and John, this here, whose clothes are dazzling white, is my son. This here, whom you prophesied to be Messiah in Caesarea Philippi, is not just Messiah by name, is Messiah because he's my son. Peter, James, and John, you will listen to him. And whatever Jesus tells them after that, they remember that God had said they must listen. Which means when Jesus says, let's go to Jerusalem, now it makes sense. So here we are, brothers and sisters. We've accompanied them. We've been flies on the wall. The one thing that we've established is the fact that Jesus, on the word from God, is not just man, but he is God. And what he's about to do on the cross would be done by the Son of God. But for what reason? So you and I can have life. And so the revelation of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration does have some direct effect on you and on me. And so this is indeed a very significant day. Amen.